He stopped for two stranded sisters in a storm, and one broken wheel changed his life. By sundown, Caleb Reed would wish he had never seen that wagon. Not because he was cruel, not because he feared hard work. Caleb had spent 20 years in the Arizona Territory, mending fences with bleeding hands, sleeping under cold stars, and riding through dust storms that turned the world brown. He knew trouble when it came walking, but that wagon on the flooded road was not walking. It was waiting. The rain had started before noon, soft at first, then hard enough to beat the desert flat. Water ran in thin brown lines along the ruts, carrying sand, horse droppings, and broken twigs down toward the wash. Caleb's black horse, Juniper, kept tossing her head, unhappy with the mud sucking at her hooves. Caleb pulled his coat tighter and lowered his hat brim. He was 3 days out from a horse job near Red Mesa, with tired bones and $30 tucked inside his vest. He had planned to reach Mercy Ridge before nightfall, eat something warm, and maybe rent a bed that did not have ants in it. That was all he wanted. Then he saw the wagon leaning beside a mesquite tree, one rear wheel sunk crooked into the mud. 2 women stood near it. The taller one had one hand pressed to the wagon side, like she was holding the whole thing upright by will alone. Rain had darkened her brown dress and pinned loose strands of auburn hair to her cheeks. The younger woman stood closer to the horses, whispering to them, trying to calm them though her own shoulders shook from the cold. Caleb slowed Juniper. A sensible man might have ridden on. A storm like that could turn a shallow wash into a killing river before a person had time to pray. But Caleb's mother had raised no sensible man when it came to stranded travelers. He stopped. "You ladies hurt," he called. The taller woman looked at him sharply. Her eyes were not frightened exactly. They were careful. Gray eyes, steady as a rifle barrel, but tired enough to tell the truth her mouth had not said yet. "We are fine," she answered. The younger one looked at her, then at Caleb. "We are not fine, Abigail." Abigail's jaw tightened. Caleb climbed down, boots landing in mud with a soft, ugly sound. "Name S. Caleb Reed. I do not mean harm, I saw the wheel." "We did too," Abigail said. "That does not mean we need a stranger taking charge." There was pride in her voice, but it was not foolish pride. It sounded like the last good coat a person owned, worn thin but still buttoned to the throat. Caleb nodded once and walked around the wagon without coming too close to the women. The left rear wheel was split through the hub, not cracked from age, not snapped from a hard stone alone. He crouched and wiped rain from the wood with his thumb. There were fresh cut marks near the spoke. His face changed, but only for a breath. The younger woman noticed. "What is it?" Caleb stood slowly. "Wheels ruined. You try to move this wagon, it will roll 20 yards and drop you sideways." Abigail stepped nearer. "Can it be fixed?" "Not here, not properly, but it can be braced enough to get you out of the open." "We have no money for repairs," she said at once. "I did not ask." "That is what worries me." The words landed between them harder than the rain. Caleb looked at her then, really looked. This was no helpless woman waiting to be rescued. This was a woman who had learned that help sometimes came with a rope hidden behind its back. He respected that. "My mother used to say a man who only does kindness for pay is not kind. He is hired." Caleb turned back to the wheel. "There is an old freight shed about half a mile east. Roof is half gone, but it will keep some rain off. You and your sister should wait there while I work." The younger woman's face softened. "I'm Ruth Bell. This is my sister, Abigail. We are headed to Mercy Ridge." "Got kin there?" Ruth glanced at Abigail. Abigail answered instead, "We have land." That was all she said, but Caleb heard what she did not add. Land meant hope. It also meant trouble, especially for women traveling alone with a wagon full of tools, bedding, seed sacks, and a locked trunk tied under canvas. Caleb looked back at the broken wheel. Who knew you were coming? Abigail went still. Why? Because this wheel did not break honest. Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. Abigail's face lost a shade of color, but her voice stayed even. You are mistaken. Maybe. Caleb bent and touched the cut again. But I have mended enough wagons to know the difference between weathered wood and a blade. The wind pushed rain across the road in silver sheets. One of the wagon horses stamped and pulled against the traces. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Abigail lowered her eyes toward the mud, and Caleb saw her fingers tighten around a small brass key hanging from a ribbon at her throat. She hid it quickly, but not quickly enough. What is in Mercy Ridge? Caleb asked. A house, Ruth said before Abigail could stop her. At least we hope it is still there. And a deed, Abigail added. Our father left us 160 acres outside town, Bitter Creek land. Caleb's stomach sank. He knew that name. Bitter Creek was not just dirt and grass. It sat near the only clean spring for miles. Men had fought over less. Abigail saw the knowledge in his face. You know it. I know enough to say you should not be sitting on this road when dark comes. He went to work without another word. First, he led the horses loose and tied them beneath the mesquite where the ground held firm. Then he hauled 2 crates from the wagon and used them to lift the bad side just enough. His coat was soaked through before 10 minutes passed. Rain ran down his neck into his shirt, under his collar. Mud swallowed one knee as he knelt. Ruth tried to help, handing him rope and a lantern with a trembling flame. Abigail stood watch, one hand near the small pistol tucked beneath her shawl. Caleb pretended not to see it. The brace was ugly but strong. He cut a short beam from a broken tailboard, shaved it clean with his knife, and bound it across the cracked hub with leather straps and wire from his saddlebag. Twice, thunder rolled over the desert so loud the horses shivered. Once, Caleb's knife slipped and opened his thumb. Ruth gasped. It is nothing, he said. Abigail stepped forward anyway, took his hand, and wrapped it with a strip torn from her own sleeve. Her touch was careful. Her face was not soft, but something in her eyes shifted. You should have ridden past, she said quietly. Caleb looked toward the darkening road. I considered it. Why didn't you? He could have given her a fine answer, something noble, something pretty. Instead, he told the truth. Because somebody wanted you stopped out here, and I do not like helping cowards get what they want. Abigail's lips parted, but no words came. By the time the wagon was steady enough to move, the sky had turned the color of gunmetal. Caleb took the lead rope and guided the team slowly toward the old freight shed. The women walked behind, their skirts brushing wet brush, their boots heavy with mud. They had gone only a short distance when Juniper lifted her head and gave a sharp snort. Caleb stopped. Across the wash, half hidden behind a stand of greasewood, a rider sat watching them. No lantern, no call, no movement. Just a dark shape beneath a low hat, still as judgment. Abigail saw him too, her breath caught. Caleb's hand moved to the rifle on his saddle. Then the rider turned his horse and disappeared into the rain. The freight shed leaned against the storm like an old man too stubborn to fall. Its roof sagged on one side, and the door hung by one rusted hinge, but there was enough shelter inside for the horses, the wagon, and 3 soaked souls who did not know yet whether they had been saved or followed. Caleb led the team in slow, careful steps, listening behind him more than ahead. The rain hid tracks. It softened sound. It made every shape seem closer than it was. Abigail walked beside Ruth now, but her eyes stayed fixed on the dark road where the rider had vanished. Her fingers had returned to the brass key at her throat. Caleb noticed again. He said nothing. Inside the shed, the air smelled of wet wood, old hay, and dust that the rain had not reached. A cracked feed trough lay against one wall. A broken lantern sat on a barrel. Somebody had once slept there, maybe a freighter, maybe a drifter, maybe a man with nowhere better to be. Caleb unhitched the horses and rubbed them down with a scrap of burlap from the wagon. Ruth found a dry corner and knelt near their small bundle of supplies, her hands shaking as she untied a bedroll. Abigail stood near the open doorway, watching the rain. "You know who that rider was," Caleb said. It was not a question. Abigail did not turn. "No." Ruth looked up. Caleb took off his hat and shook rain from the brim. "Miss Bell, lying is a hard habit to keep warm in weather like this." Abigail turned then, slow and proud, though her face was pale. "And trusting strangers is a fine way to end up buried where no one knows your name." "That is true," Caleb said. His answer seemed to surprise her. He hung his coat on a nail and crouched near the wagon wheel, checking the brace again. It had held for the short pull, but not by much. The leather had stretched under the weight, and the cracked hub groaned every time the wagon shifted. Ruth moved closer to him. "Can we reach Mercy Ridge tomorrow?" "Maybe," Caleb said. "If the road dries some, if the brace holds, if whoever cut this wheel does not come back." Abigail's eyes flashed. "You are sure now?" "I was sure when I saw it. I was polite before." A long silence followed. Outside, thunder rolled across the flats. The horses shifted and breathed, their bodies steaming faintly in the cold air. Ruth sat on a crate and pressed both hands to her face. She looked younger than she had on the road, almost girl-like, with her wet hair clinging to her temples and fear sitting plainly in her shoulders. Abigail went to her at once. "We are all right," she whispered. "No, Abby," Ruth said, voice breaking. "We are not. We were followed from Dry Hollow. You know we were. And now the wheel and that man watching from the wash. We should tell him." Abigail's mouth tightened. "We do not know him." He stopped. "That does not make him safe." Caleb stood and stepped back from them, giving the sisters space. He understood fear. He had seen it in cattle before a lightning strike, in horses before a bad fall, in men before a gunfight they never wanted. Fear made living creatures mean, foolish, silent, or brave, sometimes all at once. He took a small tin from his saddlebag, wrapped his cut thumb properly, then opened his own pack. There was coffee, a little salt pork, and a heel of bread hard enough to argue with. He set them on an overturned crate. "Eat something," he said, "both of you." Ruth blinked at him. "That is your food." "It is food. Food does not care who owns it." Abigail looked as if she wanted to refuse, but Ruth's stomach gave a soft, painful sound. Caleb pretended not to hear it. Abigail did hear. Her face changed, and pride lost its battle with love. She nodded once, "Thank you." Caleb made a small fire in a ring of stones near a gap in the wall where smoke could escape. The flame fought the damp at first, then caught. Soon the shed filled with a faint orange glow. Shadows moved over Abigail's face as she warmed her hands, and for the first time Caleb saw how tired she truly was. Not tired from the road alone. Tired from carrying decisions. Ruth ate slowly, careful not to seem greedy. Abigail barely touched her portion until Ruth pushed half the bread toward her. "You need it too," Ruth said. Abigail gave her a look that was almost a smile. "You have been bossy since you learned to speak. And you have been impossible since before I was born." For one quiet moment, the shed felt less like a hiding place and more like a room. Caleb saw the sisters not as strangers with trouble behind them, but as two women trying to hold a family together with nothing but a deed, a wagon, and stubborn hearts. Then a board creaked outside. All three froze. The horses lifted their heads. Caleb reached for his rifle and moved to the door without sound. Rain fell beyond the doorway in silver streaks. The yard outside was empty. The road was a black ribbon in the storm. but on the muddy ground near the shed entrance, something had been placed where it had not been before. A folded paper, pinned beneath a small stone. Caleb stepped out, picked it up, and came back inside. Water dripped from the brim of his hat onto the floor. Abigail stared at the paper like it might bite. "What is it?" Ruth whispered. Caleb unfolded it. The message was short, written in blocky letters with black ink that had begun to bleed from the rain. "Bitter Creek belongs to men who can hold it. Turn back before morning." Ruth made a small sound. Abigail's face hardened so quickly that Caleb knew she was using anger to cover fear. She took the note from his hand, read it twice, then held it over the fire until the edge caught flame. Caleb stopped her wrist before the whole thing burned. "Do not destroy what may tell us something." Her eyes locked on his. "It tells us enough. It tells us somebody is scared of you reaching that land." Abigail's voice dropped. "No, it tells us my father was right to hide the second deed." The fire snapped. Ruth looked at her sister, as if Abigail had just opened a grave. Caleb slowly released Abigail's wrist. "The second deed?" he asked. Abigail closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the pride was still there, but now grief stood behind it. "Our father did not just leave us Bitter Creek," she said. "He left proof that the biggest rancher in Mercy Ridge has been using land that was never his." Outside, somewhere beyond the rain, a horse gave a low, distant whinny. And this time, another horse answered from the dark. The second horse answered from somewhere close enough to make the shed feel smaller. Caleb moved first. He pinched out the lantern flame with 2 wet fingers, leaving only the low fire against the stones. The sudden dimness pulled Ruth's breath into a soft gasp. Abigail stepped toward the wagon, but Caleb caught her eye and gave the slightest shake of his head. "No quick movements." Outside, rain whispered over the roof and ran off the broken edge in steady streams. The horses inside the shed stood tense, ears forward, bodies still. Caleb knew animals rarely lied about danger. If the watcher was far, they would settle. If he was close, they would feel him. They felt him. Caleb took his rifle and slipped to the gap beside the hanging door. He did not step into the open. He only looked. At first there was nothing but black rain, gray brush, and the pale shine of water gathering in wagon ruts. Then lightning opened the sky. For one bright second, Caleb saw 2 riders on the far side of the road. One sat broad in the saddle with a long coat hanging dark around him. The other was slimmer, restless, turning his horse in a nervous half-circle. Both were watching the shed. Then darkness swallowed them again. Caleb eased back. "How many?" Abigail whispered. "2." Ruth hugged her arms around herself. "Do they mean to come in?" "If they wanted that, they would already be here," Caleb said. "They want you afraid enough to run before daylight." Abigail lifted her chin, but her hand trembled near the key at her throat. "Then they will be disappointed." Caleb admired the words. He did not trust them. Bravery spoken warm by a fire was one thing. Bravery after a long night of hoofbeats and threats was another. He crouched beside the low flame and held out his hand. "The deed, let me see it." "No," Abigail said at once. "Abby," Ruth pleaded. "No, Ruth." Caleb did not raise his voice. "That paper is why somebody cut your wheel and followed you through a storm. If I am standing between you and them, I need to know what kind of trouble I am standing in. You are free to leave." "That was not my question." Abigail stared at him, and for a moment her face looked older than it should have. Rainwater dripped from a loose strand of hair at her cheek. Her dress was muddy at the hem. She was exhausted, cornered, and still fighting to decide whether this man with tired eyes and a bandaged thumb was danger or mercy. At last Ruth spoke softly. "Father trusted Mr. Reed in his way." Abigail turned to her. "Father never met him." No, but father trusted men who helped when there was no profit in it. He wrote that in his last letter. Those words changed the air. Abigail's eyes lowered, and her thumb brushed the brass key again. She reached beneath the wagon seat and pulled out a small black satchel. It was plain, but Caleb saw the care in how she held it, like it carried more than paper. She unlocked it with the key and removed a cloth-wrapped packet tied in blue ribbon. The ribbon had once been fine. Now it was worn thin from being handled too often. Abigail untied it. Inside were 2 deeds, a survey map, and a letter folded so many times the creases had turned white. Caleb leaned close but did not touch until she nodded. The first deed named Abigail Bell and Ruth Bell as owners of 160 acres at Bitter Creek, left by their father, Nathaniel Bell. The second was older. It showed that a strip of grazing land, now widely believed to belong to Bartholomew Kane of the Box K Ranch, had been purchased by Nathaniel years before under a different filing. Caleb's mouth tightened. Bartholomew Kane was not the sort of man anyone accused lightly. He owned cattle, water rights, store credit, and half the fear in Mercy Ridge. Caleb had never worked for him, but he had heard enough around campfires. Kane smiled in public and ruined people quietly. "This is why he wants you gone," Caleb said. Abigail's face sharpened. "You know him." "I know of him." "That sounds careful." "It is. Careful keeps people alive." Ruth looked between them. "Can he take the land?" "If these papers are real, not lawful," Caleb said. "But law out here sometimes walks slower than greed." Abigail folded the deeds again with stiff fingers. "Our father died before he could come west and settle it. He wrote that Kane had been warned. He wrote that if anything happened to him, we must bring the papers to Judge Mercer in Mercy Ridge." "And did anything happen to him?" Caleb asked. Ruth's eyes filled, but she turned away before tears could fall. Abigail answered. "He was found at the bottom of a boarding house stair in Santa Fe. They called it an accident." Caleb said nothing. There were accidents in the West, plenty of them. But there were also accidents men arranged and then grieved over in clean shirts. The fire popped, sending a small trail of sparks upward. Abigail wrapped the papers again. He was not a perfect man. He chased land more than he stayed home. He made promises he did not always keep, but he loved us. In his last letter, he said Bitter Creek was the only honest thing he had left to give. Ruth wiped her cheek with her sleeve. He said the spring ran clear even in August. Caleb looked toward the open door, where the rain blurred the night. A clear spring in August could make poor land valuable and rich men dangerous. A hoof struck stone outside. This time close. Caleb rose and motioned the sisters behind the wagon. Abigail obeyed, though anger burned in her eyes at being placed out of sight. Ruth crouched beside her, clutching the satchel to her chest. A voice came from the rain. "You in the shed. Send the women out and you can ride away clean." Caleb stood just inside the shadow, rifle low but ready. "That offer sounds poor." The man outside gave a short laugh. "Poor is better than dead." Abigail flinched at the word, and Caleb hated the man for noticing fear he had caused. "I am not looking for trouble," Caleb called back. "Then stop standing in front of it." The second rider said something Caleb could not catch. The first rider snapped at him to shut up. That told Caleb something useful. One was confident, one was not. Caleb raised his voice. "Tell Kane the Bell sisters will reach Mercy Ridge by noon tomorrow." Silence followed. Then the voice came colder. "You just named a man you should have left unnamed." Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. "Names do not scare me much." "They should." A shot cracked through the storm. Not into the shed, not at the women. It struck the old signboard above the doorway and split it clean down the middle. Ruth cried out. The horses reared against their leads. Dust and splinters rained over Caleb's shoulders. He did not fire back. He only stood in the darkness, jaw hard, waiting. After a moment the rider called, "Morning, Cowboy. That is as long as your kindness lasts." Hooves turned in the mud. The riders moved off, slow enough to prove they were not afraid. Only when the sound faded did Ruth begin to breathe normally again. Abigail came from behind the wagon with the satchel held tight and shame in her eyes, as if being frightened were some failure she could not forgive herself for. Caleb lowered the rifle. "They will come back," she said. "Yes. And you still mean to help us?" Caleb looked at the broken sign, the shaking horses, the two sisters who had crossed half a territory carrying their father's last hope in a rain-soaked satchel. "Yes," he said, "but come morning we do not take the road they expect." Ruth stared at him. "There is another way." Caleb nodded toward the black hills beyond the shed. Old mining trail through Widow's Cut, harder on the wagon, easier to hide. Abigail's voice was quiet. "And if the brace fails?" "Then we carry what matters and leave the wagon." She looked down at the satchel. For the first time since he had met her, Abigail Bell looked less like a woman trying to prove she needed no one, and more like a daughter terrified of losing the last piece of her father. If this moment touched your heart, stay with the story, because the truth waiting in Mercy Ridge had not yet shown its cruelest face. Near dawn, when the rain finally thinned and gray light crept over the desert, Caleb stepped outside to check the road. In the mud near the shed, he found a fresh mark pressed deep beside the wagon tracks. Not a horseshoe. A cattle brand burned into a piece of leather and nailed to the ground. The mark was a boxed K. The box K lay in the mud like a warning nailed to the earth. Caleb crouched beside it, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, and studied the piece of leather without touching it. The brand had been burned deep and clean. Whoever left it wanted no mistake, no doubt, no chance for Abigail Bell to pretend the threat came from some nameless drifter. Bartholomew Kane had marked the ground before them. Behind Caleb, the shed door creaked. Abigail stepped out with the black satchel clutched under her shawl. Dawn had barely broken, and the gray light made her face look carved from worry. "What is it?" she asked. Caleb stood and used his boot to cover the leather with mud, proof that Mr. Kane has more pride than sense. She looked past him and saw enough before the mud swallowed the mark. Her lips pressed together. "He wants us afraid." "He already knows you are afraid," Caleb said. "Now he wants you ashamed of it. That is how men like him work." Abigail's eyes cut to him. "You speak as if you know men like him well." "I do." She waited. Caleb looked toward the hills, where Widow's Cut opened like a dark crease between stone shoulders. He had not planned on telling her anything about his past. Most men carried old stories the way they carried scars, hidden unless weather or pain forced them into view. But Abigail had shown him the deed. Ruth had trusted him with her fear. It seemed poor manners to keep pretending. He was only a passing cowboy with no history of his own. "I worked one season near Tucson for a ranch boss named Elias Ward," he said. "He dressed fine, prayed loud, and paid late. When a widow refused to sell him her grazing rights, her barn caught fire. Nobody proved a thing. Nobody ever did with men like that." Abigail's face softened a little. "What happened to her?" "She left. He got the land. And I rode away because I was younger then and thought being angry counted as doing something." The words tasted bitter, even after all the years between. Abigail looked at the mud covering the boxed K. "Is that why you stopped for us?" Caleb did not answer right away. From inside the shed came the sound of Ruth folding blankets, then a horse stamping at flies that were not there. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I am tired of riding away." For once, Abigail had no sharp answer. They prepared before the sun cleared the ridge. Caleb stripped the wagon of everything that did not matter: a cracked mirror, a small chair, 2 bundles of books and a trunk of dishes were hidden in the shed beneath old hay. Ruth fought tears over the books, holding one against her chest before placing it down. "They were Mother S.," she said. Abigail put a hand on her shoulder. "We will come back for them." Ruth nodded, but Caleb saw she did not believe it. He did not lie to comfort her. The West had a habit of taking things left behind. They kept food, blankets, tools, water, the satchel, 1 Bible, 2 dresses, and a small wooden box Ruth refused to explain. Caleb did not ask. The wagon sat lighter afterward, but the braced wheels still looked mean and tired. Widow's Cut was no road for a damaged wagon. It was hardly a road for a mule. The old mining trail climbed through scrub and stone, twisting between boulders where rainwater still ran in narrow streams. Caleb led the horses by hand. Abigail walked beside the bad wheel, watching every turn. Ruth followed with a rifle she clearly did not know how to carry. After half an hour, Caleb stopped and gently took it from her. "Barrel down when you are walking," he said. "Finger away from the trigger unless you mean to use it." "I do not mean to use it," Ruth whispered. "Good, then let it be a tool, not a terror." He showed her how to hold it safely, how to balance the weight, how to breathe when her hands shook. Abigail watched with guarded eyes, but she did not interfere. The trail narrowed near a sandstone wall streaked black from rain. The wagon groaned as the bad wheel dipped into a rut. Caleb pushed his shoulder against the sideboard while Abigail shoved from behind. Ruth urged the team forward, her voice soft but steady. "Easy now, easy, boys." The horses pulled. The wheel caught. For one awful second the brace bent so far Caleb thought it would snap. Then the wagon lurched free. Ruth laughed once, breathless from fear, then covered her mouth as if joy were too dangerous to show. Abigail leaned against the wagon, chest rising hard. Mud streaked her sleeve. A loose strand of auburn hair stuck to her cheek. Caleb noticed the raw place on her palm where rope had burned the skin. "Let me see that," he said. "It is nothing. That seems to be a family habit." She almost smiled. He took her hand and wrapped it with a clean strip from his own spare shirt. Her fingers were cold. She watched him work, and the silence between them changed again. Not trust, not yet, but something had stepped closer. "You should know," Abigail said quietly. "If Judge Mercer refuses to hear us, Cain wins. Then we make sure he hears you. You make it sound simple. It is not simple, it is just necessary." They moved on. By noon, the rain was gone and the desert steamed under a pale sun. Clouds broke apart over the mountains, revealing blue sky in ragged pieces. The land opened below them, and for the first time they saw Mercy Ridge in the distance. A white church steeple. A crooked line of buildings. Smoke rising from chimneys. And beyond it, green land following the silver thread of Bitter Creek. Ruth stopped walking. "Is that it?" Abigail stepped beside her, the satchel pressed against her ribs. Her eyes filled, though no tear fell. "Yes," she said, "that is Father's land." Caleb looked too. The creek land was better than he expected. Cottonwoods grew along the water. Grass spread thick near the banks. Even from that distance he could see why Cain wanted it. Then he saw movement below. 4 riders waited, where the mining trail met the lower road. They were not hiding now. One of them sat on a tall chestnut horse, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, wearing a dark coat too clean for the muddy morning. Even from the ridge, Caleb knew a powerful man when he saw one. Abigail's voice went cold. "Cain." Caleb looked at the broken wheel, the tired horses, Ruth's frightened face, and Abigail standing with her father's last hope held beneath her shawl. The path behind them was too narrow to turn around. The path ahead was blocked. Bartholomew Cain removed his hat, as if greeting guests to his own front porch, and waited at the bottom of the hill. Bartholomew Kane waited like a man who believed the whole valley had been built for him to stand in it. He did not shout. He did not draw a weapon. He only sat on that chestnut horse at the foot of Widow's Cut, his dark coat buttoned neat, his silver hair combed back under a black hat. The 3 men with him spread across the trail just enough to make the message plain. No wagon would pass unless Kane allowed it. Caleb stopped the team halfway down the slope. The damaged wheel groaned, and one of the horses tossed its head as if it could smell trouble in the dust. Ruth stood behind the wagon seat, both hands wrapped around the rifle Caleb had shown her how to carry. She was trying to look steady. Her pale knuckles told the truth. Abigail stepped forward before Caleb could stop her. He caught her arm gently. "Let me speak first." "No," she said, eyes fixed on Kane. "He has been speaking through cut wheels and night riders. It is time he heard my voice." Caleb wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her pride could get a body hurt just as quick as fear. But when he looked at her face, he saw more than pride. He saw a daughter who had crossed miles of mud and danger carrying her father's name like a lantern in the dark. So he let go. They walked the wagon down together. Kane smiled as they came close, and it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Miss Bell," he said, removing his hat, "I had heard you were coming. I did not expect you to choose such a poor road." "I did not choose it," Abigail answered. "Your men helped decide it." One of Kane's riders shifted in the saddle. Kane's smile held. Careful words matter in Mercy Ridge. Folks here do not care for wild accusations. Then they should not make them easy. Caleb almost smiled at that, but his hand stayed near the rifle hanging at his saddle. Kane noticed. Men like him noticed everything. "And you are?" Kane asked Caleb. "Passing through. With a broken wagon and 2 ladies carrying land papers. That is a generous kind of passing." Generosity bothers some men. Kane's eyes cooled, only when it is aimed foolishly. Ruth climbed down from the wagon, still holding the rifle low. Abigail looked back at her, and something silent passed between the sisters. Fear, yes, but also a promise. They had come too far to fold now. Abigail reached under her shawl and pulled out the black satchel. Kane's gaze dropped to it. For the first time, the smoothness left his face. Only a little. Only enough for Caleb to see. Abigail saw it too, and strength returned to her voice. "My father left me Bitter Creek. He also left proof that your fence crosses land you never owned. I am taking these papers to Judge Mercer." Kane gave a soft laugh. "Nathaniel Bell was a dreamer, Miss Bell, a restless man with more schemes than sense. I am sorry for your loss, but grief can make old papers look more powerful than they are." "Then you have nothing to fear from a judge." The wind moved down the cut and lifted dust around the horse's legs. Kane leaned slightly forward in his saddle. "I fear wasted time. I fear young women being misled by dead men's mistakes. I fear strangers filling their heads with courage they cannot afford." His eyes flicked to Caleb. Caleb said, "Courage is cheaper than cowardice, costs less in sleep." Kane's jaw tightened. One of his men, the nervous rider from the night before, looked away. Caleb recognized the shape of him now. Young, narrow-faced, maybe 20. He had the look of a man who had ridden into work he wished he could ride out of. Kane raised one gloved hand. "I will make this simple. Sell me the Bitter Creek claim today. I will pay fair enough, more than 2 women alone could hope to earn from it. You can return east with money in your pockets and your dignity untouched." Abigail held the satchel tighter. "My dignity is not for sale either." Ruth's eyes shone with sudden tears, but her chin lifted beside her sister. Kane looked at them both for a long moment. Then his smile returned, thinner now. Mercy Ridge is not Boston. It does not bend because a woman brings a ribbon-tied packet and a sorrowful story. "No," Abigail said, "but truth bends less than men do." The words struck harder than she knew. One of Cain's riders muttered something under his breath. Cain turned his head just enough to silence him. Caleb saw his chance. "Road is public," Caleb said, "unless you mean to admit otherwise in front of witnesses." Cain looked around with faint amusement. "Witnesses? I see a drifter, 2 women, and my own men." "You see people who will remember." A long quiet settled. Then from behind them on the ridge came the slow creak of wagon wheels. Everyone turned. An old mule wagon appeared at the top of Widow's Cut, driven by a stout woman in a faded blue bonnet. Beside her sat a thin man with a white beard and spectacles flashing in the sun. The wagon paused, then started down carefully. Cain cursed under his breath. Caleb did not know them, but Abigail did. Hope moved across her face so quickly it almost hurt to see. "That is Mrs. Whitcomb," Ruth whispered. "From the last station. She gave us bread yesterday." The mule wagon came nearer, and the woman in the blue bonnet called out, "Morning, Mr. Cain. Strange place for a social visit." Cain's face changed back to public kindness. "Mrs. Whitcomb, Reverend Whitcomb, I was only welcoming these ladies to the valley." The old man pushed his spectacles up his nose. "Looked from above like you were blocking the trail." "Well," Mrs. Whitcomb said, looking at Caleb, the Bell sisters, then the 4 mounted men, "my eyes are old, but not that old." Cain's men shifted again. Public shame was not justice, but it could move cowards out of the road. Cain replaced his hat. His smile was gone now. "Very well," he said to Abigail. "Take your papers to Mercer. Let us see how much comfort ink gives you." He turned his horse aside. His men followed, clearing just enough space for the wagon to pass. But as Caleb led the team forward, Cain brought his horse close. His voice dropped so only Caleb could hear. "You should have stayed a passing man." Caleb looked straight ahead. "I still might." "No," Cain said softly. "You already chose." The words settled in Caleb's chest because they were true. He had chosen when he stopped in the rain. He had chosen again when he stood in the shed. Now, with Mercy Ridge waiting below and Abigail walking beside the wagon with her father's satchel against her heart, he knew the road behind him had closed. If you believe one act of kindness can change the whole road of a life, hold on to this story, because Mercy Ridge was about to test every heart that entered it. They reached town near mid-afternoon. Mercy Ridge looked peaceful at first glance. A church bell, a general store, children chasing each other near a water trough. But as the Bell wagon rolled down Main Street, doors opened and conversations died. Men removed hats slowly. Women watched from windows. Every pair of eyes seemed to know what was in the satchel. Judge Mercer's office stood beside the Land Records building, with peeling white paint and a brass nameplate polished by many nervous hands. Abigail climbed the steps first. Before she could knock, the door opened. A gray-haired clerk stood there, face troubled. "Miss Bell." "Yes." He swallowed. "Judge Mercer is gone." Ruth took one step forward. "Gone where?" The clerk looked past them toward the street, where Cain's chestnut horse now stood tied outside the hotel. "Taken ill this morning," he said, and the Land Records room was broken into before dawn. For a moment, no one moved on the courthouse steps. The clerk stood in the doorway with one hand pressed against the frame, his face pale under the shadow of his hat. Ruth held the rifle closer to her skirts, though she had no use for it in the middle of town. Abigail stared at the brass nameplate on the door as if the letters might change if she looked hard enough. Judge Amos Mercer. Gone ill. Records broken into. Caleb turned slowly and looked down Main Street. The town that had seemed sleepy a minute before now felt staged, like every window hid a pair of watching eyes. The hotel doors swung once in the wind. Cain's chestnut horse stood outside, tail flicking, saddle polished, reins looped neat. A powerful man never needed to stand in the road when fear could stand there for him. "What kind of illness?" Caleb asked. The clerk wiped his mouth with a handkerchief. "I am no doctor." "Then tell me what you saw." The man glanced past them again. He came in early, before sunup, said he had a headache and wanted the Bell file pulled from storage. I went to make coffee. When I returned, he was on the floor. Ruth made a soft sound. "Lord have mercy." Abigail stepped closer. "The Bell file." The clerk nodded. "Your father wrote months ago. Judge Mercer had the matter noted. He was expecting you." Abigail's face changed. Until then she had been holding herself together with anger. Now hope and dread struck her at once. Then he knew we were telling the truth. "He believed there was enough reason to hear you," the clerk said carefully. Caleb heard the caution, "and the records room." The clerk swallowed. Lock was forced, cabinet opened, some county maps missing, a few old filings too. "Bitter Creek filings," Caleb said. The clerk did not answer. He did not need to. Abigail's hand tightened around the satchel. "Where is Judge Mercer now?" "At his home. Dr. Harlan is with him." "Take us there." "I cannot leave the office." Caleb stepped nearer, not threatening, just close enough that the clerk had to meet his eyes. "A judge falls ill the same morning records vanish, and you are worried about an empty desk." The clerk's shoulders dropped. Shame moved across his face. "My wife is with him," he said quietly. "White House past the church, green shutters, please do not say I sent you." Abigail's voice softened. "What is your name?" "Edwin Pike." "Mr. Pike, my father may have died for those papers. If Judge Mercer still lives, he may be the only man in this town able to speak without Cain holding his tongue." The clerk looked down. "Then go quick." They did. Mrs. Whitcomb and Reverend Whitcomb stayed with the wagon outside the office, promising to keep an eye on what little the sisters owned. Ruth did not want to leave the satchel in the wagon, and Abigail would not. She held it beneath her shawl as they crossed the street, Caleb on one side of her, Ruth on the other. The people of Mercy Ridge watched them pass. A boy stopped rolling a hoop. A woman carrying flour paused beneath the general store awning. Two men outside the saloon lowered their voices. No one offered help. No one offered welcome either. Abigail felt it. Caleb knew she did by the way her steps stayed straight, too straight, like bending even a little would break her. At the church corner, Ruth whispered, "They all know." Caleb answered, "They know Cain." "That is not the same." "No," he said, "it is worse." Judge Mercer's house stood behind a low fence, with wet roses growing wild along the path. The green shutters were faded, and a porch swing moved faintly in the breeze, though no one sat on it. Caleb knocked. A thin woman opened the door. She had kind eyes and worry folded into every line of her face. "Mrs. Mercer?" Abigail asked. The woman looked at the satchel, then at Abigail's face. "You are Nathaniel Bell's daughter." "Yes." Mrs. Mercer stepped aside at once. "Come in." The house smelled of camphor, coffee, and old books. In the front room, Judge Mercer lay on a narrow bed pulled near the window for air. He was a lean man with a white beard and sunken cheeks. His eyes were closed, but his fingers moved against the blanket as if searching for something. Dr. Harlan stood nearby, packing glass bottles into a leather case. He was broad, gray, and tired-looking. "Dr." Caleb said, "Will he live?" Dr. Harlan looked at him with sharp eyes. Most folks introduce themselves before asking a man to predict the Lord's business. "Caleb Reed." The doctor grunted. "He may live, he may not speak sense today. Something struck him hard." "Something?" Abigail said. Dr. Harlan glanced at Mrs. Mercer, then lowered his voice. "I found no sign of a stroke. His pulse is weak, his skin cold, his thoughts scattered. Could be a bad heart. Could be something in his morning coffee." Ruth turned pale. Mrs. Mercer put a hand to her mouth. "Doctor." "I said could be," Harlan replied. "Not proof, and in this town proof is the only thing that survives a rich man's denial." Judge Mercer stirred. His eyelids fluttered open. Mrs. Mercer hurried to him. "Amos." The old judge looked past her, unfocused. His lips moved. No sound came at first. Abigail stepped forward, knelt beside the bed, and placed the satchel on her lap. "Judge Mercer," she said gently, "I am Abigail Bell, Nathaniel Bell's daughter." His eyes found her face. Something like fear moved through them. "Bell," he rasped. "Yes, I have the deeds." His fingers gripped the blanket. "Not enough." Abigail went still. "What do you mean?" The judge struggled for breath. Dr. Harlan moved to stop him, but Mercer lifted one trembling hand. "Ledger," he whispered. Caleb leaned closer. "What ledger?" Mercer's eyes rolled toward the window, toward the town beyond it. "Church. Old bell room. Nathaniel hid copy. Cain does not know." Abigail's breath caught. "A copy of what?" The judge's voice cracked. "Payments, witness names, survey chain, all of it." Mrs. Mercer began to cry silently. The judge fixed his cloudy eyes on Caleb. "Before sundown, he will burn it." "Who will?" Caleb asked, though he already knew. Mercer's fingers clawed weakly at the blanket. "Not Cain." The room fell silent. The judge swallowed hard, fighting to drag one more truth out of his failing body. "Pike," he breathed. Abigail stood so fast the satchel nearly slipped from her lap. Ruth whispered, "The clerk." Caleb turned toward the window. Down the street in front of the judge's office, the Bell wagon stood where they had left it. Mrs. Whitcomb was there. The Reverend was there. But Edwin Pike was crossing the street toward the church with his coat pulled tight and a bundle tucked under one arm. And behind him, moving from the hotel porch with calm, unhurried steps, came Bartholomew Kane. For a moment, no one moved on the courthouse steps. The clerk stood in the doorway with one hand pressed against the frame, his face pale under the shadow of his hat. Ruth held the rifle closer to her skirts, though she had no use for it in the middle of town. Abigail stared at the brass nameplate on the door as if the letters might change if she looked hard enough. Judge Amos Mercer. Gone ill. Records broken into. Caleb turned slowly and looked down Main Street. The town that had seemed sleepy a minute before now felt staged, like every window hid a pair of watching eyes. The hotel doors swung once in the wind. Kane's chestnut horse stood outside, tail flicking, saddle polished, reins looped neat. A powerful man never needed to stand in the road when fear could stand there for him. "What kind of illness?" Caleb asked. The clerk wiped his mouth with a handkerchief. "I am no doctor." "Then tell me what you saw." The man glanced past them again. "He came in early, before sunup, said he had a headache and wanted the Bell file pulled from storage. I went to make coffee. When I returned, he was on the floor." Ruth made a soft sound. "Lord have mercy." Abigail stepped closer. "The Bell file." The clerk nodded. "Your father wrote months ago. Judge Mercer had the matter noted. He was expecting you." Abigail's face changed. Until then she had been holding herself together with anger. Now hope and dread struck her at once. Then he knew we were telling the truth. "He believed there was enough reason to hear you," the clerk said carefully. Caleb heard the caution, "and the records room." The clerk swallowed. Lock was forced, cabinet opened, some county maps missing, a few old filings too. "Bitter Creek filings," Caleb said. The clerk did not answer. He did not need to. Abigail's hand tightened around the satchel. "Where is Judge Mercer now?" "At his home. Dr. Harlan is with him." "Take us there." "I cannot leave the office." Caleb stepped nearer, not threatening, just close enough that the clerk had to meet his eyes. A judge falls ill the same morning, records vanish, and you are worried about an empty desk. The clerk's shoulders dropped. Shame moved across his face. "My wife is with him," he said quietly. "White House past the church, green shutters, please do not say I sent you." Abigail's voice softened. "What is your name?" "Edwin Pike." "Mr. Pike, my father may have died for those papers. If Judge Mercer still lives, he may be the only man in this town able to speak without Cain holding his tongue." The clerk looked down. "Then go quick." They did. Mrs. Whitcomb and Reverend Whitcomb stayed with the wagon outside the office, promising to keep an eye on what little the sisters owned. Ruth did not want to leave the satchel in the wagon, and Abigail would not. She held it beneath her shawl as they crossed the street, Caleb on one side of her, Ruth on the other. The people of Mercy Ridge watched them pass. A boy stopped rolling a hoop. A woman carrying flour paused beneath the general store awning. 2 men outside the saloon lowered their voices. No one offered help. No one offered welcome either. Abigail felt it. Caleb knew she did by the way her steps stayed straight, too straight, like bending even a little would break her. At the church corner, Ruth whispered, "They all know." Caleb answered, "They know Cain." "That is not the same." "No," he said, "it is worse." Judge Mercer's house stood behind a low fence, with wet roses growing wild along the path. The green shutters were faded, and a porch swing moved faintly in the breeze, though no one sat on it. Caleb knocked. A thin woman opened the door. She had kind eyes and worry folded into every line of her face. "Mrs. Mercer?" Abigail asked. The woman looked at the satchel, then at Abigail's face. "You are Nathaniel Bell's daughter." "Yes." Mrs. Mercer stepped aside at once. "Come in." The house smelled of camphor, coffee, and old books. In the front room, Judge Mercer lay on a narrow bed pulled near the window for air. He was a lean man with a white beard and sunken cheeks. His eyes were closed, but his fingers moved against the blanket as if searching for something. Dr. Harlan stood nearby, packing glass bottles into a leather case. He was broad, gray, and tired-looking. "Doctor," Caleb said, "will he live?" Dr. Harlan looked at him with sharp eyes. Most folks introduce themselves before asking a man to predict the Lord's business. "Caleb Reed." The doctor grunted. "He may live, he may not speak sense today. Something struck him hard." "Something?" Abigail said. Dr. Harlan glanced at Mrs. Mercer, then lowered his voice. "I found no sign of a stroke. His pulse is weak, his skin cold, his thoughts scattered. Could be a bad heart. Could be something in his morning coffee." Ruth turned pale. Mrs. Mercer put a hand to her mouth. "Doctor." "I said could be," Harlan replied. "Not proof, and in this town proof is the only thing that survives a rich man's denial." Judge Mercer stirred. His eyelids fluttered open. Mrs. Mercer hurried to him. "Amos." The old judge looked past her, unfocused. His lips moved. No sound came at first. Abigail stepped forward, knelt beside the bed, and placed the satchel on her lap. "Judge Mercer," she said gently, "I am Abigail Bell, Nathaniel Bell's daughter." His eyes found her face. Something like fear moved through them. "Bell," he rasped. "Yes, I have the deeds." His fingers gripped the blanket. "Not enough." Abigail went still. "What do you mean?" The judge struggled for breath. Dr. Harlan moved to stop him, but Mercer lifted one trembling hand. "Ledger," he whispered. Caleb leaned closer. "What ledger?" Mercer's eyes rolled toward the window, toward the town beyond it. "Church. Old bell room. Nathaniel hid copy. Cain does not know." Abigail's breath caught. "A copy of what?" The judge's voice cracked. "Payments, witness names, survey chain, all of it." Mrs. Mercer began to cry silently. The judge fixed his cloudy eyes on Caleb. Before sundown, he will burn it. Who will? Caleb asked, though he already knew. Mercer's fingers clawed weakly at the blanket. Not Cain. The room fell silent. The judge swallowed hard, fighting to drag one more truth out of his failing body. Pike, he breathed. Abigail stood so fast the satchel nearly slipped from her lap. Ruth whispered, "The clerk." Caleb turned toward the window. Down the street in front of the judge's office, the Bell wagon stood where they had left it. Mrs. Whitcomb was there. The Reverend was there. But Edwin Pike was crossing the street toward the church with his coat pulled tight and a bundle tucked under one arm. And behind him, moving from the hotel porch with calm, unhurried steps, came Bartholomew Kane. Caleb moved before anyone else had found breath. He was out the door and down the porch steps with Abigail close behind him, her skirt catching at the gate as she ran. Ruth followed, calling her sister's name, but Abigail did not slow. Across the street, Edwin Pike was already halfway to the church, walking too fast for a man with honest business and too slow for a man who did not want to be seen. Kane followed behind him like a shadow that owned the sun. "Pike," Caleb shouted. The clerk stopped. Only for a breath. Then he ran. The town woke all at once. A woman cried out from the general store. A dog barked near the saloon. Men stepped into doorways but stayed there, as if the dust at their boots had nailed them in place. Caleb cut across the street, mud splashing up his trousers. Abigail ran beside him, her face pale but fierce. The black satchel bounced beneath her shawl, held tight against her ribs. Kane did not run. That frightened Caleb more than if he had. Kane simply watched, calm and certain, as Pike reached the church steps and stumbled inside. The church door slammed. Caleb reached it first and threw it open. The sanctuary was dim and cool, smelling of old pine, candle wax, and damp hymn books. Morning light came through narrow windows, falling in pale strips across the empty pews. At the far end, near the pulpit, a small side door stood open. The bell tower. Abigail pushed past Caleb. He caught her hand. "Stay behind me." "Not this time." "Abigail." She turned on him, eyes bright with fear and anger. "That ledger may be the last true thing my father left in this world. I will not stand outside while men decide whether I am allowed to keep it." Caleb saw there was no moving her, not without breaking the very thing he had begun to admire. So he nodded. Together they crossed the sanctuary. Above them, wood groaned in the tower. Pike was climbing. Ruth reached the church door behind them, breathless. "Abby." "Stay here," Abigail said. Ruth shook her head hard. "No." Before Abigail could answer, Reverend Whitcomb hurried in from the street, his white beard trembling. Mrs. Whitcomb came behind him with her bonnet crooked and her hands full of worry. The Reverend looked at the open tower door. "What is happening?" Caleb said, "Your bell room may hold a ledger Nathaniel Bell hid there." The Reverend's eyes widened. "Nathaniel Bell." "You knew him?" Abigail asked. Reverend Whitcomb looked toward the tower, then back to her. "He came through Mercy Ridge 2 summers ago, stayed one night, asked too many questions about land and old survey lines. I thought him only another dreamer. He was my father." The old man's face fell. "Then I owe you more than I knew." A crash sounded above. Caleb did not wait. The tower stairs were narrow, steep, and dusty. Caleb climbed fast, one hand on the rail, the other near his holster. Abigail followed so close he could hear her breathing. Halfway up, he smelled smoke. "Not much." "Enough." "Pike," Caleb called, "do not be a fool." From above came a broken voice. "I never wanted this." Caleb reached the bell room and found Edwin Pike backed against the wall beneath the great bronze bell. A small iron stove sat in the corner, cold from years of disuse, but Pike had brought a lantern and a bundle of papers. One corner of the bundle was already singed, a thin ribbon of smoke rising into the rafters. Abigail made a sound like her heart had been struck. Pike held the papers away from her. His face was wet with sweat, his eyes red and wild. "Stay back," he said. Caleb lifted both hands slow. "No one is touching you." "You do not understand," Pike said. "None of you understand." Abigail stepped forward, "Then explain it." Pike looked at her and shame pulled his face out of shape. "My boy is sick, has been for months. Dr. Bill's medicine dead at the store. Kane said he would clear it, said he would send for medicine from Prescott. All I had to do was delay the judge, misplace records, make sure your claim died quiet." Ruth appeared at the top of the stairs, one hand pressed to the wall. She had heard every word. Abigail's voice softened, but it did not weaken. "And my father." Pike shut his eyes. "I do not know, I swear it. I only know Kane feared what he carried." Caleb looked at the smoke curling up from the ledger. "Edwin, listen to me. If you burn that, Kane owns you forever, not just your debt, your soul." Pike's hand shook. From below, Kane's voice floated up through the stairwell, smooth as polished stone. "Mr. Pike, you have done enough talking." Caleb's jaw tightened. Kane was in the church. Pike heard him too, and panic took hold. He turned toward the lantern, meaning to finish what he had begun. Abigail moved first. She did not grab the papers. She grabbed Pike's wrist with both hands and held on. "Please," she said. "My father died trying to bring this truth here. Do not bury him twice." Pike stared at her. The smoke thickened. A small flame licked the bottom edge of the ledger. Caleb snatched his coat from his shoulder and slapped it over the fire. The flame died under wool, leaving only a bitter smell and blackened paper edges. Pike sank against the wall as if his bones had left him. "I am sorry," he whispered. Abigail took the ledger from his hands. It was scorched at the corner, but whole enough. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were names, payments, dates, survey notes, and one folded page tucked near the back. She pulled it free. Her father's handwriting covered the paper. Abigail read the first line and went still. Caleb saw the color drain from her face. "What is it?" Ruth whispered. Abigail looked toward the stairs, where Kane's steps now climbed slowly toward them. "My father knew Kane would come after us," she said, "and he named the man who helped him. The man named in Nathaniel Bell's letter was not Bartholomew Kane. That was what made the tower go silent." Abigail held the scorched page in both hands, her eyes moving over her father's careful writing again and again, as if she hoped the words would change. Ruth stood beside her, one hand on her sister's arm. Caleb watched Kane reach the top of the stairs and step into the Bell room with his hat in his hand, and a calm face that belonged in a church pew, not at the edge of a ruined crime. Kane looked at the ledger, then at the letter. "Well," he said softly, "I suppose the dead still like to gossip." Abigail lifted the page. "My father wrote that Sheriff Daniel Crow helped you force settlers from their claims." For the first time, Kane's eyes shifted. "Not much, but enough." From below, boots sounded on the church floor. A deep voice called up, "Everything all right, Mr. Kane?" Caleb turned toward the stairwell. Sheriff Crow was already in the church. He was a thick man with a red beard and a badge pinned high on his vest. Caleb had seen men like him in rough towns before, men who wore the law like a coat and took it off when money spoke. Crow climbed into the Bell room with one hand resting on his belt. His eyes went straight to the ledger. Then to Pike. "You look poorly, Edwin," Crow said. Pike lowered his head. Abigail stepped forward. "My father named you." Crow gave her a slow smile. "Your father was a sick man chasing old quarrels." "He was murdered for what he knew," Ruth said, voice trembling. The sheriff's smile faded. "Careful, girl." Caleb moved between Ruth and Crow before Abigail could answer. "Speak to her like that again, and that badge will not save your teeth." The room tightened. Cain raised one hand. "No need for temper. We are in the Lord's house." Reverend Whitcomb's voice came from the stairs. "Then perhaps you should remember he hears well." The old reverend stepped into the bell room, breathing hard from the climb. Behind him came Mrs. Whitcomb, stern as winter. Her eyes went to the burned ledger and then to Cain. "I remember Nathaniel Bell," the reverend said. "He came to me frightened. He said if anything happened to him, his daughters would come one day with the original deeds. He left a copy here because he did not trust the courthouse." Crow's face darkened. "Preacher, you best think before you speak." Cain's calm began to crack at the edges. A hidden ledger and an old man's memory do not make law. "No," Abigail said, "but they make truth." She opened the ledger and read aloud. Names of families who had sold land after threats, payments made through Sheriff Crow's office, survey notes changed by force, witnesses paid to vanish. Caleb watched the color drain from Pike's face and the anger rise in Crow's. Cain stood still, but his jaw worked once, then again. Below, voices gathered. Townspeople had entered the church. They stood in the aisle listening. For years, Mercy Ridge had whispered about Cain. Now whispers had found a voice. Crow reached for the ledger. Caleb caught his wrist. The sheriff swung with his other hand, but Caleb ducked and drove him back against the wall. The bell above them gave a low, deep groan as the tower shook. Ruth cried out. Mrs. Whitcomb pulled her back from the stairs. Cain lunged toward Abigail. Not to hurt her, to take the letter. Abigail held it high, but Cain's hand closed around her sleeve. The satchel slipped from her shoulder and struck the floor. Papers spilled across the boards like white birds with broken wings. Caleb released Crow and turned, but Pike moved first. The frightened clerk threw himself between Cain and Abigail. "No more," Pike shouted. "No more of this." Cain shoved him hard. Pike fell against the stove, knocking the dead lantern aside. Glass shattered. Abigail stumbled backward, clutching the letter to her chest. The bell rope swung loose beside Ruth. She saw it, her eyes widened. Then she grabbed it with both hands and pulled. The bell roared above them. The sound crashed through the tower, through the church, through the whole town of Mercy Ridge. It was not a call to worship. It was a cry for every silent person to wake up. Ruth pulled again. The bell thundered. People ran in from the street. Men from the saloon, women from the store, the blacksmith with soot still on his arms. Mrs. Mercer, pale and shaking, helped by Dr. Harlan. Judge Mercer himself was not there, but his wife carried his written statement, signed with a weak hand and witnessed by the doctor. Cain stared down through the tower opening at the growing crowd. For the first time he looked trapped. Caleb seized Crow's pistol and tossed it across the room. 2 men from town rushed up and held the sheriff back. Not Cain's men, not hired hands, ordinary men who had watched too long and finally found shame stronger than fear. Abigail descended the stairs slowly, holding the letter and ledger. At the front of the church she stood where the morning light crossed the floor. Her dress was torn at the sleeve. Mud stained her hem. Her hair had fallen loose around her face, but her voice was clear. "My father was Nathaniel Bell. He was not perfect. He made mistakes. He stayed away when we needed him near. But he died trying to leave my sister and me something honest. This ledger proves land was stolen, records were changed, and families were threatened. I ask this town now, not as a woman begging mercy, but as a rightful owner demanding truth. Will you let the man who frightened you keep owning your silence too?" No one spoke. Then Edwin Pike stepped forward, weeping openly. "I helped hide records," he said. "I delayed Judge Mercer. I put medicine debt above the truth. Mr. Cain paid me. Sheriff Crow knew." Crow cursed him. But the church had already heard enough. Cain looked around at the faces of Mercy Ridge and saw no doorway left open. His power had not vanished, but it had cracked. And once fear cracked, even a rich man could hear the sound. Caleb stood beside Abigail, close but not touching her. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the storm road, the broken wheel, the long night, and something new that neither of them dared name yet. Outside, the bell's echo faded over Bitter Creek. And from the back of the church, a young boy pushed through the crowd holding Caleb's black horse by the reins. "Mister," the boy said breathlessly, "someone cut your saddle straps." Caleb looked at the boy, then at Juniper standing in the churchyard with her ears pinned back and rain-damp reins hanging loose. Cut saddle straps meant one thing. Someone had meant for him to ride out fast and fall hard. Abigail saw it too. Her face went white, then red with anger. "They tried to hurt you." Caleb stepped down from the church porch and took the ruined leather in his hand. The cut was clean, made with a sharp knife. It was not panic work. It was the last ugly reach of a man who had lost control and still wanted one final wound left behind. Cain stood between two townsmen now, his fine coat dusty, his face stripped of its old smoothness. Sheriff Crow was held near the pulpit by the blacksmith and another man, both looking ashamed it had taken them so long to stand against him. Caleb turned back toward Cain. For a second, the whole churchyard held its breath. Abigail moved beside him and touched his arm, not to stop him with force, just to remind him who he had chosen to be. Caleb looked at her hand, then at Cain. "No," he said quietly. Cain's mouth curled. "No what?" "No more fear, no more road tricks, no more men like you making decent people carry your sins for you." He dropped the cut strap into the mud. "I will not give you the fight you want." That seemed to strike Cain harder than a fist would have. His power had always depended on making others angry enough, scared enough, desperate enough to stumble. Caleb would not stumble for him. Dr. Harlan came forward with Mrs. Mercer's written statement. Reverend Whitcomb held the scorched ledger in both hands like it was a Bible. Abigail gave Nathaniel Bell's letter to Mrs. Mercer, and Mrs. Whitcomb gathered the spilled deeds from the church floor, smoothing each page with careful fingers. By sunset, Mercy Ridge was no longer whispering. Pike confessed in front of the town, not proudly, not cleanly. He shook through every word and wept when he spoke of his sick son, but he told the truth. Cain had paid debts, threatened jobs, bought silence, and used Sheriff Crow to scare families off land near Bitter Creek. Crow denied it until the blacksmith named the night his own brother had been forced from a claim. Then another man spoke, then a widow. Then a storekeeper who had changed records because he feared losing credit. Truth came slowly at first. Then it came like rain after a long drought. Judge Mercer lived through the night. By morning, weak but clear-minded, he ordered the Bell claim protected until a territorial hearing could be held. Sheriff Crow was stripped of his badge by the town council and held under guard until a deputy marshal could be sent for. Cain was not dragged through the street, not beaten, not given the bloody ending men like him secretly expect. He was made to sit in the front pew while every stolen name was read aloud. That was punishment enough for a proud man. 3 days later, Abigail and Ruth stood at Bitter Creek for the first time. The spring ran clear beneath cottonwoods, cold water slipping over smooth stone. Grass bent in the wind, bright from the storm. Their father's land was rough, untended, and smaller than the dream he had written about, but it was real. Ruth knelt near the creek and washed mud from her hands. Then she opened the small wooden box she had carried from the wagon. Inside was a faded ribbon, a lock of their mother's hair, and a tiny painted portrait of Nathaniel Bell as a younger man. Abigail stared at it for a long while. "I wanted to hate him," she said. Ruth sat beside her. "I know. He left too often, promised too much, made us cross half the world for land wrapped in danger." Caleb stood a few steps away, giving the sisters room. Abigail touched the portrait with one finger, but he tried to leave us something no man could take. Ruth leaned her head on Abigail's shoulder, and we kept it. For the first time since Caleb had met her, Abigail Bell cried without turning away. The weeks that followed were not easy. Bitter Creek did not become a home because a judge said it was theirs. Fences had to be raised. The old cabin needed a roof. The well had to be cleaned, and the wagon wheel, faithful as it had been, finally gave out near the creek bank with a tired crack that made Ruth laugh instead of cry. Caleb stayed to fix it. Then he stayed to mend the cabin door. Then he stayed to help dig post holes. By the time the first cool winds of autumn moved through the valley, nobody in Mercy Ridge called him a passing man anymore. One evening, as orange light spread across the creek, Abigail found Caleb on the porch of the half-mended cabin, turning the brass key from her ribbon between his fingers. She had given it to him while patching a trunk, trusting him with it without ceremony, which somehow meant more than any speech. "You never asked me to sell," she said. Caleb looked up. "Was I supposed to?" "Most men would have, or told me what to do with the land, or called it foolish." "It is your land." She sat beside him. "And if I asked you to help me build it?" He looked toward Ruth near the creek, hanging wash on a line between two young cottonwoods. He looked at the repaired wagon, the fresh posts, the little cabin catching gold in its windows. Then he looked at Abigail, whose storm-gray eyes no longer seemed guarded from the whole world. "I would say yes," he answered. Her hand found his. Years later, folks in Mercy Ridge would tell the story in many ways. Some said it began with a broken wheel. Some said it began with a hidden ledger in a church tower. Ruth said it began when Abigail finally learned that accepting help did not mean surrendering strength. Caleb had his own answer. He said it began in the rain, when two sisters had every reason not to trust him, and he chose to be worthy of trust anyway. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and tell me in the comments whether you would have trusted Caleb on that storm road. And long after Cain's fences were moved, long after Bitter Creek became a working ranch with a white porch, strong horses, and children running barefoot through summer grass, Abigail kept the scorched ledger wrapped in blue ribbon inside a cedar drawer. Not as a memory of fear. As proof that truth, once carried by brave hands, can still find its way home.